That's the difference between successful people and everyone else. Successful people see opportunities and grab them. My contributions became invisible footnotes in his success story. When relatives asked about the impressive website, Bob would say he'd invested in some professional marketing. When they complimented the company's social media presence, he'd talk about bringing the business into the digital age. I didn't mind, not at first. I was proud of what we'd accomplished together, and seeing the business thrive felt like victory enough. My parents were proud of Bob's success, and by extension, proud to be part of a family with a thriving business owner. It felt good to know I'd played a part in that, even if nobody else knew. But as the months went by, the invisibility started to sting. At the previous year's family reunion, Bob had given an impromptu speech about the importance of hard work and business acumen. He'd talked about how some people are born entrepreneurs while others are content to work for someone else their whole lives. The implication was clear. He was the entrepreneur, the visionary, the one who'd built something meaningful. Everyone else, myself included, were just employees, followers, people who lacked the drive to create their own success. Danny, meanwhile, had been promoted to marketing director at the company, a title that looked impressive on paper, but mostly involved posting the content I created and taking credit for strategies I developed. At family events, he'd casually mention his marketing expertise and talk about the campaigns he was running. Nobody questioned it. Why would they? He worked at the company full-time, he had the title, and he was Bob's son. I kept telling myself it didn't matter. I had my own career, my own life in Columbus. The work I did for Martinez Construction was just a side project, a way to help family. I didn't need recognition or credit. I was doing it out of love, out of loyalty, out of the satisfaction that comes from solving problems and making things better. But love and loyalty have their limits, and mine were about to be tested in front of 30 family members at a community center in Cedar Falls, Ohio. The morning of this year's reunion, I'd driven down from Columbus with a trunk full of homemade desserts and a heart full of optimism. I'd spent the previous week putting together a surprise presentation for Bob, a comprehensive report showing how his business had grown over the past 3 years, complete with revenue charts, client testimonials, and projections for future expansion. I thought he might appreciate seeing the full scope of what we'd accomplished together. I'd also prepared something else, something I'd been working on for months. A proposal for expanding Martinez Construction into residential development, complete with market analysis, financial projections, and architectural concepts. It was ambitious, forward-thinking, the kind of strategic planning that could take the company to the next level. I'd imagined presenting these ideas to Bob quietly, maybe after the reunion when we could talk privately. I'd pictured his face, lighting up with possibility, his gratitude for my continued dedication to the family business. I'd even allowed myself to imagine him acknowledging my contributions publicly, maybe giving me an official role in the company's future. Instead, I got a microphone pointed at me like a weapon and laughter that felt like a slap across the face. Standing there by the dessert table, holding my pie and my dignity in equal measure, I made a decision that would change everything. Wasn't going to defend myself. I wasn't going to explain my contributions or list my accomplishments or beg for recognition. I was going to let the truth speak for itself. Because sometimes the most powerful response to humiliation isn't words. Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's knowing that the people who underestimate you are about to learn exactly how wrong they've been. I set down my plate, walked calmly to the bathroom, and sent a text message that had been waiting in my drafts folder for 3 months. Mr. Chen, it's time. Please proceed with the announcement as planned. His response came back immediately. Are you sure? There's no going back after this. I looked at myself in the mirror above the sink, straightened my shoulders, and typed, "Heck, I've never been more sure of anything in my life." When I returned to the main room, Uncle Bob was still holding court near the DJ booth. regaling a group of cousins with stories about his latest construction project. The laughter had died down, but I could still feel the residual energy of the moment, the way a room feels after someone's been publicly humiliated. My mom approached me cautiously, her face a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "Honey, you know Bob didn't mean anything by that. He's had a few drinks, and you know how he gets when he's been drinking." "I know exactly how he gets," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Aunt Carol, my mom's sister and the only family member who'd ever really seen me, appeared at my elbow. "That was uncalled for," she said quietly. "Bob owes you an apology." But I wasn't interested in apologies anymore. Apologies were just words, and words had lost their power to heal the damage that had been building for years. What I wanted was something much more permanent, much more meaningful. What I wanted was justice. And in exactly 37 minutes, I was going to get it. David Chen arrived exactly when he said he would. I watched through the community center's front windows as his silver BMW pulled into the parking lot, and my heart started beating faster. This was it. The moment 3 years of invisible work and mounting frustration had been building toward. He stepped out of his car carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that meant business. David had been Uncle, Bob's lawyer and business partner for over a decade, handling contracts and legal matters while Bob focused on the construction side. What most people didn't know was that David had also become something of a mentor to me over the past year, watching my contributions to the company with growing appreciation and concern. 6 months ago, during one of our quarterly business reviews, David had pulled me aside after Bob left the room. "Alex," he'd said, his voice careful and measured, "do you realize what you've done for this company?" I'd shrugged it off the way I always did. "I just helped with some marketing stuff." "Some marketing stuff?" David had laughed, but not unkindly. "You've increased revenue by 300%. You've transformed the entire client experience." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You've positioned Martinez Construction as a premium brand in a commodity market. That's not marketing stuff, Alex. That's business transformation. That conversation had planted a seed that grew into something much larger over the following months. David started asking me more detailed questions about my vision for the company, my ideas for expansion, my thoughts on the industry's future. He'd invite me to lunch meetings under the guise of discussing marketing strategy. But we'd end up talking about everything from supply chain optimization to employee development. "Have you ever considered that you might be running the wrong person's business?" he'd asked during one of those lunches, his question hanging in the air like a challenge. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe you shouldn't be building someone else's dream. Maybe you should be building your own." That's when David had explained something I'd never known about the company's ownership structure. When Bob had incorporated the business 15 years earlier, he'd been required to designate potential successors and establish protocols for ownership transfer. It was a standard practice for small businesses, designed to ensure continuity if something happened to the primary owner. What wasn't standard was what David had convinced Bob to do 3 months ago. "Your uncle isn't getting any younger," David had explained during a particularly tense meeting where Bob had taken credit for yet another strategy I'd developed. "And Danny, well, let's just say Danny isn't demonstrating the kind of business acumen needed to run a growing company." Bob had been drinking more lately, making increasingly poor decisions, and showing signs of wanting to step back from the day-to-day operations. The problem was that Danny, his obvious heir, was spectacularly unqualified to take over. He could barely manage the basic administrative tasks he'd been assigned, let alone lead a company through its next phase of growth. "I've been thinking about succession planning," David had told Bob during that meeting, "about ensuring the company's future is in the right hands." The conversation had been delicate, but David was skilled at these kinds of negotiations. He'd presented it as a tax strategy, a way to protect Bob's investment while ensuring the business continued to thrive. The paperwork had been complex, involving ownership transfers and management agreements, but the outcome was simple. As of 3 months ago, I owned 60% of Martinez Construction and Development. Bob retained 30%, and would I continue as president for ceremonial purposes, while Danny kept his 10% and his meaningless title. The transition was designed to be gradual, with my ownership remaining private until Bob was ready to announce his succession plan. But sitting in that community center, watching my uncle humiliate me in front of our entire family, I'd decided that gradual wasn't going to work anymore. David walked through the front doors just as the DJ started playing some classic rock song that had half the room singing along. I caught his eye and nodded toward the back corner where we could talk privately. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" he asked when we were out of earshot. "Once we make this public, there's no taking it back. Your relationship with your uncle will never be the same." I thought about all the times I'd swallowed my pride, all the credit I'd let others take, all the moments I'd made myself smaller so that other people could feel bigger. I thought about Bob pointing that microphone at me like I was the family. Disappointment about Danny's mock toast, about 30 relatives laughing at my expense. "David," I said, "my relationship with my uncle hasn't been real for years. It's been transactional. I give, he takes, and everyone pretends that's normal. I'm done pretending." He nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what we were about to do. "All right then, let's change the trajectory of this family gathering." David walked toward the front of the room with the confidence of someone who'd delivered life-changing news many times before. I stayed in the back, my heart pounding as I watched him approach the DJ booth where Bob was still holding court. "Excuse me," David said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "Bob, I need to speak with everyone for a moment. It's important." The music stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward the front of the room where David stood next to my uncle, briefcase in hand. "Sorry to interrupt the party," David continued, "but I have some business matters to discuss that affect the entire family." Bob looked confused, slightly annoyed at having his spotlight interrupted. "David, whatever it is can wait until Monday. This is a family reunion, not a board meeting. Actually, it can't wait, and it very much concerns the family." The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the little kids had stopped running around, sensing that something important was happening. I could see my parents near the buffet table. My mom's face creased with worry, my dad's arms crossed defensively. David opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. 3 months ago, Bob, you and I completed a comprehensive restructuring of Martinez Construction and Development. Tonight seems like the perfect time to announce those changes to the family. Bob's face had gone pale. "David, I don't think this is the appropriate—" "You just spent 10 minutes telling everyone about business success and failure," David interrupted smoothly. "About who makes something of themselves and who doesn't. I think it's time the family learned the truth. About who's actually been making something of Martinez Construction." I watched from the back of the room as realization dawned on Bob's face. He'd forgotten. In his drunken state, he'd completely forgotten about the ownership transfer, about our agreement, about the fact that his business was no longer entirely his business. "Ladies and gentlemen," David announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to courtroom presentations, "I'm here tonight to formally announce that as of 3 months ago, Alexandra Johnson has become the majority owner of Martinez Construction and Development." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Someone's phone buzzed. A chair squeaked as someone shifted their weight, but nobody spoke. "Furthermore," David continued, "the company's remarkable growth over the past 3 years, the tripling of revenue, the expansion into high-end markets, the development of a premium brand presence, has been almost entirely due to Miss Johnson's strategic vision and marketing expertise." Bob's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. Danny had gone completely white, his beer bottle suspended halfway to his lips. The website that has generated over $2 million in new business? Alex built it? The social media presence that has attracted Fortune 500 clients? Alex created and manages it. The proposal system that has increased our contract success rate by 400%? Alex designed it. I could see my mother's face turning from confusion to shock, to something that might have been pride. My father was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. In fact, David said, his voice warming with what sounded like genuine admiration, Alex has been the strategic architect behind every major business decision at Martinez. Construction for the past 3 years. While completing her regular job in Columbus, she has essentially been running a construction company that now generates over $5 million in annual revenue. The folder in David's hands contained 3 years' worth of documentation, emails showing my strategic recommendations, time-stamped files proving I'd created every piece of marketing material, analytics reports demonstrating the direct correlation between my interventions and revenue growth. It was all there, meticulously documented, impossible to deny. So when Bob mentioned earlier that some people make something of themselves while others can't figure out what they want to be when they grow up, David said, his eyes finding mine across the room. I thought it was important for everyone to know that Alex hasn't been figuring out what she wants to be. She's been busy becoming the most successful business owner in this family. The room erupted, not with laughter this time, but with shocked exclamations, rapid conversations, and the sound of 30 people trying to process information that completely contradicted everything they thought they knew. I heard my Aunt Carol's voice above, the noise. Alex, is this true? I walked slowly toward the front of the room, every step feeling surreal. When I reached David's side, he handed me a document from his folder. This is the official ownership transfer, I said, my voice somehow steady despite my racing heart. Signed 3 months ago. I am now the majority owner of Martinez Construction and Development. Bob was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to bewilderment, as if he couldn't quite process how the family disappointment had become his business partner, and now, his boss. But, Danny stammered, I'm the marketing director. I handle all the marketing. David smiled, grimly, and pulled out another document. Actually, Danny, according to our records, your primary contributions to the marketing department have been posting content created by Alex and attending meetings where Alex presented strategies she'd developed. Your official role moving forward will be significantly reduced. The implications were sinking in around the room. Uncle Bob, the family success story, the self-made businessman who loved to give speeches about entrepreneurship and hard work, had been essentially fronting for his niece's business acumen for 3 years. My cousin Jake, who'd barely spoken to me since high school, was staring at me with something that looked like respect. Alex, how long has this been going on? 3 years of business development, I replied. 3 months of legal ownership. And about 30 seconds of family members finally knowing the truth. Aunt Carol started laughing, but it was the good kind of laughter, the kind that comes from genuine delight rather than mockery. You sneaky genius, she said, shaking her head in amazement. All this time we thought you were just floating around, with no direction, and you were building an empire. Not an empire, I corrected. Just a business that I apparently needed to own officially before anyone would believe I was capable of running it. Bob finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. Alex, why didn't you tell anyone? Why keep it secret? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for months. Why had I allowed David to structure the ownership, transfer privately? Why hadn't I demanded recognition for my contributions earlier? Because I kept hoping you'd acknowledge what I was doing on your own, I said simply. I kept thinking that eventually, someone in this family would notice that I wasn't the failure you all assumed I was. The truth was more complicated than that, of course. I'd been afraid. Afraid of seeming arrogant. Afraid of disrupting family dynamics. Afraid of claiming credit for work that had been collaborative, even if the collaboration was largely invisible. I'd been raised to be modest, to let others shine, to find satisfaction in quiet contribution rather than public recognition. But there's a difference between modesty and self-erasure, and I'd crossed that line years ago. The business restructuring was Bob's idea, David interjected diplomatically. He recognized that the company needed strong leadership for its next phase of growth, and he wanted to ensure it stayed in the family. It was a kind lie, the sort of face-saving fiction that allowed everyone to pretend this had been planned, rather than forced by circumstances. Bob seized on it gratefully. "That's right," he said quickly. "I've been mentoring Alex for years, grooming her to take over. This was always the plan." I could have contradicted him. I could have pulled out my phone and shown everyone the text messages where he'd dismissed my ideas, the emails where he'd taken credit for my work, the countless instances where he'd treated me like an unpaid intern rather than a business partner. But I didn't. Not because he deserved my protection, but because I didn't need his humiliation to validate my success. The facts spoke for themselves. The business records were clear. My ownership was legal and legitimate. Whether Bob wanted to pretend he'd planned this all along was irrelevant to me. What mattered was that everyone in this room now knew the truth. The family failure was actually the family success story. The quiet cousin who couldn't figure out her life had figured out how to transform a struggling construction company into a thriving enterprise. Danny was still processing the implications for his own future. So what happens to me? Am I fired? Nobody's fired, I said, though I could see David raising an eyebrow at that statement. But there will be changes, real accountability, actual performance metrics, the kind of business standards that should have been in place all along. My mother appeared at my elbow, her face a mixture of pride and confusion. "Honey, why didn't you tell us? We had no idea you were doing all this." "Would you have believed me if I had told you?" I asked gently. She started to answer, then stopped, really thinking about the question. Would they have believed me? Would this room full of people who'd spent the evening laughing at my supposed lack of direction have taken me seriously if I'd stood up and announced I was running a multi-million-dollar business? Probably not. Success, especially for women, especially for quiet women who don't fit the traditional entrepreneur stereotype, has to be proven rather than claimed. Tonight, it had been proven in the most dramatic way possible. The party continued around us, but the energy had completely shifted. Instead of casual family chatter, there were intense conversations happening in small groups. People kept approaching me with questions, congratulations, and apologies. Some of the reactions were genuine. Aunt Carol hugged me fiercely and whispered, "I always knew you were special, but this is beyond anything I imagined." My younger sister Emma called me from college, having heard about the announcement through the family phone tree, and screamed with excitement. Other reactions were more complicated. Danny spent the rest of the evening alternating between sullen silence and attempts to rewrite history, claiming he'd known about my involvement all along. Some relatives seemed almost offended that I'd kept such a significant secret, as if my privacy had somehow been a personal slight against them. But the most interesting reaction came from Uncle Bob himself. As the evening wore on and the initial shock faded, he seemed to settle into a strange sort of relief. The pressure of maintaining his successful businessman facade, the stress of pretending he understood digital marketing and modern business practices, the exhaustion of constantly taking credit for work he didn't fully comprehend, all of it lifted from his shoulders. "You know what, Alex?" he said to me during a quiet moment near the end of the evening. "I'm glad it's out in the open. I've been terrified for months that someone would figure out I didn't know what I was doing with all that computer stuff. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from him, and surprisingly, it was enough. I didn't need him to grovel or admit he'd been wrong to humiliate me. I needed him to acknowledge reality, and that's what he was finally doing. The ride home to Columbus that night was the strangest drive I'd ever taken. 3 hours earlier, I'd been the family disappointment heading home early from another awkward reunion. Now I was driving back as the owner of a $5 million business with a phone full of congratulatory messages and a head full of plans for the future. But the most satisfying part wasn't the money or the recognition or even the shocked looks on everyone's faces. It was the feeling of finally, completely, authentically, being myself in front of the people who'd known me longest and understood me least. For the first time in my adult life, there was no gap between who I was and who my family thought I was. No more invisible contributions, no more quiet competence, no more making myself smaller so others could feel bigger. I was Alex Johnson, business owner, strategic thinker, and the person who'd just turned a family reunion into a boardroom revelation that nobody would ever forget. The first week after the reunion was eerily quiet. I'd expected phone calls, emails, maybe some family drama spillover, but instead there was just silence. It felt like the calm before a storm, or maybe the calm after one. I wasn't sure which. I went back to my regular routine in Columbus, driving to my marketing job each morning and spending my evenings working on Martinez's construction business from my apartment. But everything felt different now. The secret I'd been carrying for 3 years was finally out in the open, and I was still processing what that meant for my life going forward. On Wednesday, my phone rang during lunch. It was my mother, and her voice had that careful tone she used when she was trying to navigate sensitive territory. "Hi, sweetheart. How are you settling back in after the weekend?" "I'm fine, Mom. Just back to normal work stuff." "Normal work stuff?" she repeated slowly. "You mean your job at the tech company or your other job running a construction business?" I almost laughed at how surreal that sounded coming from her. For years, my mother had introduced me to people as, "My daughter Alex, she's still figuring things out," with that slightly apologetic tone parents use when their adult children don't fit conventional success metrics. Now she was trying to wrap her head around the fact that I'd been running a business larger than anything else in our family. Both, I guess. They're not really separate anymore. "Alex, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. With me. Are you happy?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been carrying this enormous responsibility for years without telling anyone. That must have been incredibly lonely. And seeing how Bob treated you on Saturday, knowing what you'd been doing for him. Honey, I can't imagine how angry you must be." I sat quietly for a moment, really thinking about her question. Was I happy? It was complicated. The reveal at the reunion had been satisfying in the moment, but the underlying situation that had led to it was still messy and painful. "I'm relieved," I said finally. "For 3 years, I've been living a double life, going to family events where everyone treated me like I was drifting through life, while I was actually building something significant. It was exhausting pretending to be less than I was. Why didn't you tell us? Your father and I would have been so proud." "Would you have believed me if I had told you?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I had my answer. "I would have wanted to believe you," she said quietly. "But honestly, you're right. I probably would have thought you were exaggerating or trying to make yourself feel better about not having a traditional career path." At least she was being honest. My mother had spent years subtly encouraging me to find a real career, code for something she could easily explain to her friends. Marketing coordinator at a tech startup sounded respectable enough, but it wasn't the kind of achievement that generated bragging rights at book club meetings. Business owner, on the other hand, was something she could work with. "What happens now?" she asked. "Are you going to quit your job and run the construction company full-time?" "I don't know yet. I'm still figuring that out." The truth was, I'd been avoiding that exact question for months. David had been encouraging me to transition to full-time leadership of Martinez Construction, but I'd been hesitant to give up the security of my regular paycheck and benefits. There was also the complicated matter of working closely with Uncle Bob and Danny on a daily basis, which had seemed challenging enough when our arrangement was private. Thursday brought the first real consequence of the weekend's revelations. I was in the middle of a client presentation at my day job when my phone started buzzing with urgent text messages. Danny was having what appeared to be a complete meltdown. "Alex, I need to talk to you right now. There's a crisis at the job site and I don't know what to do. The Riverside project is falling apart and the client is threatening to pull out. Dad is nowhere to be found, and everyone's looking at me like I'm supposed to have answers. Please call me." I excused myself from the meeting and called him back. Danny's voice was shaking when he answered. "Alex, thank God. Listen, I don't understand what's happening. The client showed up this morning asking about change orders and timeline modifications, and I told them they'd have to talk to Dad, but he's not answering his phone. Then they started asking about the project management software and the scheduling system, and I realized I don't actually know how any of that works. This was exactly what I'd been afraid of. For 3 years, I'd been handling the administrative and strategic side of the business while Danny held an impressive title and collected a paycheck. Now that the truth was out, everyone expected him to actually do the job he'd been pretending to do, and he was completely unprepared. "Where's the project folder?" I asked. "All the change order protocols should be documented there." "What project folder?" "Alex, I don't think there is a project folder. I think you've been handling all of that stuff remotely and I never saw the actual systems." My heart sank. This was worse than I'd thought. Danny hadn't just been taking credit for my marketing work. He'd been completely oblivious to the operational systems I'd built to manage the business. He literally didn't know how to do his job because his job had been a fiction. "Okay, Danny, breathe. I'm going to walk you through this, but we need to have a serious conversation about your role in the company going forward." I spent the next hour on the phone with him, remotely accessing our project management system and talking him through the client situation. By the time we hung up, the immediate crisis was resolved, but a much larger problem had become clear. Martinez Construction had grown too complex for its current management structure. We had 15 active projects, 42 employees, and a sophisticated operational system that required genuine expertise to manage effectively. Danny could learn these skills eventually, but it would take months of intensive training, and we didn't have months to spare. I was going to have to make a choice. Either I could continue trying to run the business remotely while maintaining my day job, which was becoming increasingly impossible as we grew, or I could commit fully to Martinez Construction and build it into something even more substantial. That evening, I drove down to Cedar Falls for an emergency meeting with David and Uncle Bob. We met at Bob's house on Maple Street, the same house where I'd spent countless childhood holidays never imagining I'd one day be sitting at the kitchen table discussing business strategy as an owner rather than a visitor. Bob looked older than he had just 5 days earlier, the stress of the situation evident in the lines around his eyes. David had brought another folder full of documents, this one focused on operational structures and management transitions. "We have a problem," I said without preamble. "Danny doesn't actually know how to run the operational side of the business, and I can't continue managing everything remotely while working full-time somewhere else." Bob nodded slowly. "I figured as much." He called me crying this morning, completely overwhelmed. I probably should have seen this coming. "The question is what we do about it," David interjected. "We have several options, but they all require some significant changes to the current structure." He laid out 3 scenarios. Option 1 was to hire an external operations manager, and Keep Danny in a reduced role focused on basic administrative tasks. Option 2 was to invest in intensive training for Danny while I transitioned to full-time leadership. Option 3 was to restructure the company entirely, with me as CEO and Bob transitioning to a consulting role. Each option had implications for family dynamics, business operations, and my personal career trajectory. But as we talked through the details, one thing became increasingly clear. The business had outgrown its casual, family-run approach. We needed professional management, standardized processes, and clear accountability structures. "There's something else we need to discuss," David said, pulling out another document. The financial implications of Alex's increased involvement. For 3 years, I'd been essentially volunteering my expertise while maintaining my regular job. Now that my ownership was official and my role was expanding, that arrangement no longer made sense. David had prepared a compensation proposal that reflected market rates for business management and strategic consulting. The numbers were startling. Based on my contributions to revenue growth and operational efficiency, my annual compensation package would be nearly triple what I was making at my day job. It was enough money to change my entire life trajectory, to buy a house, to build real financial security for the first time in my adult life. "Alex," Bob said quietly, "I owe you an apology that goes way beyond what happened at the reunion. I've been taking advantage of your generosity for years, and I convinced myself it was okay because we're family. But family shouldn't mean exploitation." It was the first genuinely sincere thing he'd said to me in years, and it caught me completely off guard. I'd been prepared for continued defensiveness or attempts to minimize my contributions. I hadn't expected actual accountability. "I also need to be honest with you about something," he continued. "I'm tired. I've been running this business for 25 years, and the last 3 years of growth have been amazing but exhausting. I don't have the energy or the expertise to manage what this company is becoming." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe it's time for me to step back and let you actually run things the way you've been running them, but officially, with full authority and proper compensation and recognition for what you're actually doing." David smiled. "That brings us to option 4, which I didn't mention earlier. Complete transition of operational control to Alex, with Bob maintaining his ownership stake, but moving to an advisory role." The room went quiet as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about giving me credit for my contributions anymore. This was about fundamentally restructuring the business around my leadership, rather than continuing to pretend that traditional family hierarchy made sense. "What about Danny?" I asked. Bob sighed. "Danny needs to figure out what he actually wants to do with his life. This crisis has made it clear that he's been coasting on his last name rather than developing real skills. That's my fault as much as his. He could stay with the company in a different capacity," David suggested, "but not in a management role, until and unless he develops the competencies required for management." It was a delicate situation. Danny was still family, still Bob's son, still someone whose livelihood was connected to the business. But the company had grown beyond the point where nepotism could substitute for competence. Over the next 2 hours, we hammered out the details of a transition plan. I would give my current employer 4 weeks' notice and then transition to full-time leadership of Martinez Construction. Bob would remain as company president for external relations and client meetings, but I would have complete authority over operations, strategy, and personnel decisions. Danny would transition to a project coordinator role with a reduced salary and clear performance expectations. If he wanted to advance back into management, he would need to complete formal training and demonstrate measurable competencies. The financial restructuring was equally significant. My compensation would reflect my actual contributions, with both base salary and profit-sharing components. David would formalize our governance structure with proper board oversight and accountability measures. By the time I drove back to Columbus that night, My entire future had been rewritten. In 4 weeks, I would no longer be a marketing coordinator who secretly ran a construction business on the side. I would be the CEO of Martinez Construction and Development, leading a company with over $5 million in annual revenue and plans for aggressive expansion. The next morning, I submitted my resignation letter to my boss at the tech startup. She was shocked. I'd been a reliable employee with good performance reviews and no apparent reason to leave. "Is this about a better offer somewhere else?" she asked. "You could say that," I replied. "I'm transitioning to run my own business." "Your own business?" "Alex, I had no idea you were an entrepreneur. What kind of business?" "Construction and development. I've been building it for a few years, and it's reached the point where it needs full-time leadership." She stared at me, like I'd announced I was moving to Mars. "Construction? But you don't have any experience in construction." "Actually, I have 3 years of experience running a construction business. I just haven't been talking about it much." It was a conversation I had several times over the following weeks. Colleagues, friends, even my landlord seemed baffled by the idea that quiet, unassuming Alex had been building a business empire in her spare time. The cognitive dissonance was almost amusing. People found it easier to believe I was making a reckless career change than to accept that I'd been competent at something they hadn't noticed. But the most difficult conversation was with myself. For 3 years, I'd been living with the safety net of my regular job, knowing that if the business side project didn't work out, I still had steady income and benefits. Now I was giving up that security to bet everything on my ability to lead a company that had grown far beyond what I'd originally envisioned. The imposter syndrome was real and persistent. Despite all the evidence of my success, despite the revenue growth and client satisfaction and operational improvements I'd achieved, part of me still wondered if I was qualified to be a CEO. I'd never had formal business training, never worked in construction before starting with Bob, never managed employees or handled major corporate decisions. But I'd also never failed at anything I'd committed to seriously, and I'd been successfully running this business for 3 years already. The only thing changing was the official recognition of what I was already doing. My last day at the tech startup was surreal. My colleagues threw a small going-away party, complete with a cake that said, "Good luck with your new adventure." They meant well, but they still thought I was leaving to start a business rather than to formally take over one I'd already built. That evening, I packed up my apartment in Columbus. Not all of it. I was keeping the lease for now, maintaining some connection to the life I'd built there. But I was moving most of my belongings to Cedar Falls, where I'd rented a small house, just 10 minutes from the Martinez construction offices. It felt like more than a geographical move. It felt like stepping fully into an identity I'd been hiding from for years, claiming space as the person I'd actually become, rather than the person everyone expected me to be. The night before my first official day as CEO, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the reunion, about Bob's humiliating microphone moment, about the laughter that had stung so deeply just 2 weeks earlier. That laughter seemed like it had happened in a different lifetime, to a different person. Tomorrow, I would walk into the Martinez construction offices, not as Bob's helpful niece or Danny's invisible support system, but as the owner and leader of a company I'd built from the ground up. The business cards I'd ordered had arrived that afternoon. Alexandra Johnson, Chief Executive Officer. I held one of those cards in my hands as I finally drifted off to sleep, and for the first time in my adult life, the name on it matched exactly who I knew myself to be. Walking into the Martinez construction offices on my first official day as CEO felt like entering a parallel universe where everything looked the same, but meant something completely different. The same faded carpet in the reception area, the same motivational posters about teamwork and excellence that had been hanging there since I'd first visited 3 years ago, the same coffee maker that Danny had never learned to properly clean. But today, instead of being the helpful niece who occasionally stopped by with marketing suggestions, I was the boss, the person everyone would be looking to for decisions, direction, and leadership. The weight of that responsibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. Sarah, the office manager who'd been with the company for 8 years, was the first to greet me. She'd always been friendly during my previous visits, but today there was something different in her demeanor. A mixture of curiosity, respect, and barely concealed relief. "Good morning, Ms. Johnson," she said formally. "Mr. Chen asked me to prepare the management files for your review. They're on your desk." My desk. It felt strange to hear those words applied to the office space that had always belonged to Uncle Bob. David had suggested the transition would be smoother if I took over the main administrative office, while Bob moved to a smaller space that better reflected his new advisory role. The files Sarah had prepared painted a detailed picture of a company that was more successful and more complicated than I'd fully realized. Martinez Construction now employed 47 people across 5 different project teams. We had contracts worth over $8 million in various stages of completion, from initial planning to final inspection. The financial statements showed consistent growth and healthy profit margins, but they also revealed inefficiencies and missed opportunities that made my business-minded brain itch with possibilities for improvement. What struck me most was how much of the company's success was invisible to the people actually doing the work. The construction crews knew they were building high-quality projects for satisfied clients, but they didn't know why we'd suddenly started attracting better clients, willing to pay premium prices. The project managers knew their proposals were getting accepted at higher rates than ever before, but they didn't understand the strategic positioning and marketing psychology that made those proposals so effective. I'd been operating like a ghost in the machine for 3 years, improving systems and generating results without most employees ever knowing I existed. Now I needed to step out of the shadows and establish myself as a legitimate leader worthy of their respect and confidence. My first major challenge came before lunch on my very first day. Tommy Reeves, our most experienced foreman and someone who'd been with the company longer than anyone except Bob himself, knocked on my office door with an expression that clearly communicated skepticism. "Ms. Johnson, I need to talk to you about the Henderson project," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk like a man preparing for battle. "We've got some problems with the timeline, and I need to know who's actually making decisions around here now." Tommy was exactly the kind of employee who could make or break my transition to leadership. He commanded enormous respect among the construction crews, had relationships with key subcontractors, and possessed the kind of practical knowledge that couldn't be learned from business schools or marketing textbooks. If he decided I was just another inexperienced owner playing at running a construction company, his opinion would spread through the workforce faster than wildfire. "What's the situation with Henderson?" I asked, pulling up the project files on my computer. "Foundation inspection failed yesterday. Concrete didn't cure properly because of last week's rain, and we need to tear out about half of what we poured and start over. That's going to push our timeline back at least 10 days, maybe 2 weeks if we can't get the concrete crew back out here quickly." I studied the project schedule, cross-referencing it with weather reports and subcontractor availability. This was exactly the kind of crisis that separated competent business managers from people who just happened to have impressive titles. "What's our contractual obligation for weather delays?" I asked. "Standard force majeure clause gives us protection for delays beyond our control, but the client's been pushing hard for an early completion bonus. They're not going to be happy about this." "And what would you recommend we do?" Tommy paused, clearly surprised by the question. In his experience with previous management, foremen reported problems and waited for decisions to be handed down from above. They weren't typically asked for strategic input. "Honestly, I think we need to eat some of the delay costs to maintain the relationship. Henderson Development has been talking about a much larger project next year, and keeping them happy on this job could be worth a lot more than the bonus money we're going to lose." It was exactly the right answer, and it told me everything I needed to know about Tommy's understanding of the business. He wasn't just thinking about concrete and timelines. He was thinking about client relationships and long-term strategic value. "I agree completely," I said. "What would it take to minimize the delay and show Henderson that we're committed to their success, even when we're dealing with circumstances beyond our control?" Over the next hour, we developed a recovery plan that involved bringing in additional concrete crews, working weekend shifts, and coordinating with other subcontractors to compress the remaining timeline. It would cost us money in the short term, but it would demonstrate our commitment to client satisfaction and position us favorably for the larger project Tommy had mentioned. By the time Tommy left my office, his demeanor had shifted completely. He'd come in expecting to find an inexperienced new owner who would need extensive handholding. Instead, he'd found someone who understood both the technical and business implications of the situation and was willing to make smart investments in client relationships. "Ms. Johnson," he said as he reached the door, "I don't know what kind of background you have in construction, but you think like someone who's been in this business for a long time." "I've been learning from the best people in this company for 3 years," I replied, "including you, whether you realized it or not." Word of that conversation spread through the company faster than I'd expected. By the end of my first week, I'd had similar discussions with project managers, site supervisors, and department heads who'd all come to my office expecting to find an amateur and leaving impressed by someone who clearly understood their work better than they'd anticipated. But not every interaction was so positive. Danny had been conspicuously absent for most of my first week, claiming he was sick, but I knew he was struggling with the reality of his reduced role. When he finally returned to the office on Friday, his resentment was palpable. "So how does it feel to be the big-shot CEO?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm as he leaned against my office doorframe. "It feels like a lot of responsibility," I replied honestly. "How are you adjusting to your new role?" "My new role," he repeated bitterly. "You mean my demotion. Let's call it what it is, Alex. You and David maneuvered me out of my position, and now I'm basically an overpaid secretary." I could have pointed out that he'd never actually performed the duties of his previous position. That project coordination was still a valuable role that matched his current skill level, that he had opportunities for advancement if he was willing to develop new competencies. Instead, I chose a different approach. "Danny, what do you actually want from this company? Not what you think you deserve because you're Bob's son, but what would genuinely make you happy and fulfilled in your work?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. He'd come into my office prepared for an argument about hierarchy and fairness, not a conversation about personal satisfaction and career goals. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I've never really thought about it that way." "Maybe that's something worth figuring out. Because you're right that your role has changed and it's going to keep changing as the company grows. You can either grow with it, or you can spend your energy being angry about the past." It wasn't a magic conversation that solved all our family business drama, but it was a start. Danny left my office looking thoughtful rather than angry, and over the following weeks, we began to develop a working relationship based on realistic expectations rather than inherited entitlement. The real test of my leadership came during my third week as CEO, when we faced our first major crisis under my official management. One of our largest clients, Westfield Commercial Properties, called an emergency meeting to discuss what they termed serious concerns about project management and communication. Westfield represented nearly 20% of our annual revenue, and they were considering us for an even larger development project that could secure the company's growth for the next 2 years. Losing them would be catastrophic, both financially and reputationally. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning at their downtown office, and I spent the entire weekend preparing. I reviewed every document related to their projects, analyzed all our communication histories, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios they might present. What I discovered in my preparation was troubling. While the construction work itself was high quality, And on schedule, our project communication had been inconsistent and unprofessional. Email responses were delayed, change orders were poorly documented, and client concerns weren't being addressed with the urgency they deserved. The problem wasn't technical competence, it was administrative follow-through, the kind of detailed client service that requires systematic processes rather than individual heroics. It was exactly the type of operational weakness that could destroy a growing business if left unaddressed. I walked into the Westfield offices on Tuesday morning with a comprehensive presentation that acknowledged their concerns, took full responsibility for our communication failures, and outlined specific systemic changes we were implementing to ensure these problems never recurred. "Ms. Johnson," said Patricia Westfield, the company's development director, "we've been working with Martinez Construction for 2 years, and this is the first time anyone from your company has come to a meeting with this level of preparation and accountability. I appreciate your patience with our growing pains," I replied. Martinez Construction has expanded rapidly over the past few years, and our administrative systems haven't always kept pace with our growth. That changes now. I spent the next hour walking them through our new project management protocols, client communication standards, and quality assurance processes. Every procedure was documented, every responsibility was clearly assigned, and every timeline was realistic and measurable. By the end of the meeting, Westfield had not only agreed to continue our existing projects, but had also invited us to bid on their flagship development, a $12 million mixed-use complex that would be the largest project in Martinez Construction's history. "Ms. Johnson," Patricia said as we concluded the meeting, "in 20 years of working with contractors, I've rarely seen someone take ownership of problems the way you just did. Most people spend their time making excuses or shifting blame. You spent your time solving problems." That meeting became a turning point for how I understood my role as CEO. It wasn't enough to be the strategic mastermind behind the company's success. I also needed to be the public face of our professionalism and accountability. Clients needed to see that Martinez Construction was led by someone who understood their businesses and shared their commitment to excellence. Over the following months, I established new systems for everything from client communication to employee training to financial reporting. I hired an experienced project coordinator to work alongside Danny, bringing professional expertise while giving him opportunities to learn proper business practices. I instituted weekly management meetings where department heads could raise concerns before they became crises. Most importantly, I began to develop my own leadership style, rather than trying to imitate what I thought a CEO should look like. I discovered that my natural inclination toward detailed preparation and systematic problem-solving was actually a significant asset in the construction industry, where precision and reliability were valued more than flashy presentations or aggressive salesmanship. The company's culture began to shift in subtle but important ways. Employees started bringing me ideas for improvements rather than just reporting problems. Clients began requesting me specifically for project meetings and contract negotiations. Subcontractors commented on how much easier it had become to work with Martinez Construction since our communication and coordination had improved. By the end of my 4th month as official CEO, we had landed 3 major new contracts, including the Westfield project. Our revenue projections for the year were exceeding our most optimistic estimates. More importantly, employee satisfaction. Surveys showed significant improvements in job security, communication, and confidence in company leadership. But the most satisfying change was in my own sense of professional identity. For the first time in my adult life, there was perfect alignment between my capabilities, my responsibilities, and the recognition I received for my contributions. I wasn't hiding my competence or diminishing my achievements to make other people more comfortable. I was exactly who I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The shy girl who had been laughed at for trying to help her family had become a confident business leader who commanded respect from clients, employees, and industry peers. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. psychological, and completely irreversible. When Uncle Bob stopped by my office one afternoon to discuss a potential client referral, he paused in the doorway and smiled. "You know, Alex, seeing you in this role, it's like watching someone finally come home to themselves. I should have seen it years ago." "Maybe," I replied. "But maybe I needed to prove it to myself before anyone else could see it." "Well, you've certainly done that. And then some." He was right. I had proven it to myself and to everyone else who had ever doubted my potential. The family failure had become the family's success story, and this time, there was no question about who deserved the credit. 18 months after the reunion that changed everything, I found myself standing in the executive boardroom of the Marriott, downtown, surrounded by lawyers, investors, and business executives discussing the potential acquisition of Martinez Construction and Development by Pinnacle Group for $47 million. The irony wasn't lost on me that less than 2 years ago, I'd been publicly humiliated as a family failure, and now I was negotiating the sale of a business empire I'd built from the shadows. The acquisition discussions had begun 6 months earlier, when Marcus Rivera from Pinnacle Group approached me after our successful completion of their $14 million commercial complex. What had started as a conversation about future projects had evolved into something much more significant when Pinnacle's parent company, Meridian Holdings, expressed interest in acquiring successful regional construction firms as part of their national expansion strategy. "Ms. Johnson, the due diligence process has been remarkably smooth," said Catherine Walsh, Meridian's chief acquisition officer. "In 20 years of evaluating construction companies, I've rarely seen such comprehensive systems, transparent financials, and consistent growth metrics. Your operation is exactly what we're looking for in a strategic acquisition." The numbers were staggering. Martinez Construction, which had been struggling to maintain $2 million in annual revenue when I'd first started helping Uncle Bob, was now generating over $15 million annually with projected growth to $25 million within 3 years. The company employed 96 people across 2 offices, maintained contracts with some of the region's most prestigious developers, and had established a reputation for innovation and reliability that extended far beyond our original market. But the financial success was only part of what made the acquisition attractive to Meridian. They were equally impressed by our operational efficiency, employee retention rates, client satisfaction scores, and systematic approach to quality control. The business I'd built wasn't just profitable, it was sustainable, scalable, and professionally managed in ways that exceeded industry standards. David Chen sat beside me at the conference table, his expression reflecting the same mixture of pride and amazement that had characterized our relationship since the ownership transfer. "Alex, when we first discussed your potential for leadership, I knew you had exceptional business instincts, but even I didn't anticipate this level of transformation." The acquisition terms were generous beyond anything I'd imagined when I first started secretly building websites for Uncle Bob's struggling construction company. The $47 million purchase price would be divided according to our ownership percentages, with my 60% share resulting in a personal payout of over $28 million. Uncle Bob would receive $14 million for his 30%, while Danny's 10% would net him nearly $5 million. More importantly, the acquisition agreement included provisions for me to remain as regional president of Martinez Construction under the Meridian umbrella, with expanded authority to develop similar operations in other markets. It wasn't just a financial windfall. It was recognition of my capabilities as a business leader and an invitation to apply those capabilities on a much larger scale. The negotiations had been complex, involving months of financial audits, legal reviews, and strategic planning sessions. Throughout the process, I'd been struck by how naturally I'd adapted to the role of primary decision-maker for the transaction. The shy girl who had once hesitated to speak up at family dinners was now confidently negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts with sophisticated investors and corporate executives. Catherine Walsh had been particularly impressed by my presentation. During the final negotiations, where I'd outlined a 5-year expansion plan that could replicate the Martinez construction model in 6 additional markets across the Midwest. The plan was ambitious but achievable, built on the systematic approaches to client service, employee development, and operational efficiency that had driven our original success. Ms. Johnson, your strategic vision for regional expansion aligns perfectly with Meridian's growth objectives, Catherine had said during one of our planning sessions. We're not just acquiring a successful construction company, we're acquiring a proven business model and the leadership expertise to implement it at scale. The acquisition process had also provided an opportunity to reflect on the personal transformation that had made this professional success possible. 2 years ago, I'd been living a double life, secretly building a business while allowing others to take credit for my contributions. The fear of claiming recognition for my work had kept me trapped in a role that was simultaneously essential and invisible. The reunion confrontation with Uncle Bob had been the catalyst that forced me to choose between continued invisibility and authentic leadership. The humiliation of that moment had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I'd been forced to defend my worth rather than quietly demonstrate it, and that defense had led to the ownership transfer that changed everything. Now, sitting in a boardroom where my expertise was valued and my leadership was sought after, I could see that the reunion incident hadn't been a personal failure. It had been a necessary awakening. The laughter that had stung so deeply had actually been the sound of old limitations breaking apart, making room for new possibilities I'd been too cautious to pursue on my own. Uncle Bob had adapted to the acquisition news with characteristic pragmatism, though I could see the emotion beneath his business-focused exterior. During one of our private conversations about the sale, he'd been more reflective than I'd ever seen him. "Alex, I need you to understand something. When I pointed that microphone at you and called you a failure, I wasn't just being cruel or drunk or stupid, though I was certainly all of those things. I was terrified. Terrified of what? Terrified that people would figure out that my successful business was actually your successful business. Terrified that everyone would realize I'd been taking credit for work I didn't understand and couldn't replicate. The humiliation I put you through was really my own fear of being exposed as incompetent. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and it helped me understand the psychological dynamics that had driven our complicated relationship. Bob hadn't been maliciously trying to suppress my success. He'd been desperately trying to maintain his own image as a successful entrepreneur when he was actually functioning more as a figurehead for my strategic vision. The funny thing is, he continued, pretending to be the mastermind behind the business was exhausting. I spent 3 years terrified that someone would ask me a question I couldn't answer or expect me to replicate strategies I didn't understand. Stepping back and letting you take official control was the most relaxing thing I'd done in years. Danny had shown the most dramatic personal growth throughout the acquisition process. Initially bitter about his reduced role in the company, he'd gradually embraced the opportunity to develop genuine professional skills, rather than relying on inherited authority. The structure and accountability I'd implemented had actually helped him discover capabilities he'd never had the chance to develop under the old family business model. "Alex, I need to tell you something that's been bothering me for months," Danny said during one of our acquisition planning meetings. "When Dad humiliated you at the reunion, I laughed along with everyone else. But I knew better. I'd been watching you transform the business for 3 years, and I knew you were the real strategic mind behind our success. Why didn't you say anything?" "Because it was easier to let people think I was contributing more than I actually was. But watching you navigate these acquisition negotiations, seeing how the Meridian executives respond to your leadership, I realize I was complicit in diminishing someone whose success was making my own career possible." The acquisition had also prompted conversations with other family members who were beginning to understand the full scope of what I'd accomplished. My parents had initially been confused by the news that I was selling a business they'd barely known I owned. But as the details emerged, their perspective on my career trajectory had shifted dramatically. "Alex, your father and I have been talking, and we owe you more than an apology," my mother said during a family dinner where we'd gathered to discuss the acquisition. "We spent years worrying that you weren't ambitious enough, weren't focused enough, weren't building toward anything meaningful. Meanwhile, you were quietly building something more substantial than anything else in our family." My father, never comfortable with emotional conversations, had found his own way to express his recognition of my accomplishments. "I've been bragging about you to everyone at work," he admitted. "My daughter, the business mogul. I probably sound like one of those annoying parents who can't stop talking about their kids' achievements. Dad, you can brag all you want. I've waited a long time to give you something worth bragging about." "That's just it, though. You've been giving us things to be proud of for years. We just weren't paying attention." The most meaningful conversation had come from Aunt Carol, who had always been the family member most attuned to undercurrents and unspoken dynamics. She'd requested a private lunch to discuss the acquisition, but our conversation had quickly moved beyond business matters. "Alex, I need you to know that some of us saw what was happening, even when you were keeping it quiet. I watched you at family gatherings for years, noticed how you'd deflect credit and minimize your contributions. I kept hoping you'd eventually claim the recognition you deserved." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I could see you weren't ready to hear it. You were so invested in being the helpful one, the supportive one, the one who solved problems, without expecting acknowledgement. I think you needed to get angry before you could get confident." She was right. The anger I'd felt during and after the reunion had been the emotional catalyst that allowed me to stop accepting diminished recognition for my contributions. The humiliation had been painful, but it had also been clarifying. For the first time, I'd seen my family's treatment of me from the outside, and I'd realized that their perception of my worth had more to do with their own limitations than with my actual capabilities. The acquisition celebration dinner was held at the same Riverside Community Center where my transformation had begun, but this time the space was transformed into an elegant venue befitting a multi-million-dollar business transaction. The same room where Uncle Bob had humiliated me was now filled with employees, clients, and business partners, celebrating the sale of a construction empire that had grown from the ashes of that humiliation. Catherine Walsh from Meridian Holdings gave a toast that captured the significance of what Martinez Construction had become under my leadership. In the acquisition business, we evaluate companies based on financial performance, operational efficiency, and growth potential. But the most important factor is leadership quality, and Alex Johnson represents the kind of visionary leadership that transforms industries. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, coming from people who had worked alongside me as I'd built the business from a struggling family operation into a regional powerhouse. These weren't relatives laughing at my pretensions. These were professionals acknowledging my achievements based on results they'd witnessed firsthand. Tommy Reeves, now our head of operations, approached me during the cocktail hour with his characteristic directness. "Ms. Johnson, I've been in construction for 32 years, and I've worked for a lot of different companies. I've never seen anyone transform an organization the way you transformed this one." "Tommy, the transformation was a team effort. You and the other department heads were essential to everything we accomplished." "Maybe so, but leadership matters. And you showed us what real leadership looks like. Not the kind that takes credit for other people's work, but the kind that makes other people better at their jobs." The comment was pointed, clearly referencing the old management style that had characterized Martinez Construction before my official leadership role. Tommy and the other longtime employees had lived through the transition from Bob's chaotic management approach to my systematic business practices, and their loyalty had been earned through demonstrated competence rather than inherited authority. Patricia Westfield from our first major client success was also in attendance, representing the business relationships that had been crucial to our growth. Alex, when we first started working with Martinez Construction, we were impressed by the quality of the construction work. But what kept us coming back and recommending you to other developers was the professionalism of your business operations. The client relationships I'd built had been based on consistent communication, transparent processes, and delivered promises. Unlike the old approach where client service was reactive and relationship dependent, I'd implemented systematic approaches that ensured every client received the same high level of attention and accountability. The acquisition by Meridian is exciting for us as clients, Patricia continued, because it means we'll have access to the same Martinez construction quality and service on potentially much larger projects. The acquisition agreement included provisions for existing clients to maintain their relationships with the Martinez construction team while gaining access to Meridian's broader resources and capabilities. It was exactly the kind of win-win arrangement that had characterized my approach to business development throughout the company's transformation. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with Marcus Rivera from Pinnacle Group, whose initial approach had led to the acquisition discussions. Alex, I have to admit that when we first started working together, I was impressed by your project management capabilities. But I didn't fully appreciate your strategic vision until I saw how you'd position the company for this acquisition. The strategic positioning he was referring to had been deliberate, developed over months of planning, as I'd recognized the potential for acquisition interest from larger firms. The systematic improvements in operations, the expansion into new markets, the development of scalable business processes, all of it had been designed to create value that would be attractive to potential acquirers. The beauty of what you built, Marcus continued, is that it's not dependent on any single relationship or individual expertise. You created systems and processes that could be replicated and scaled, which is exactly what Meridian was looking for in a regional partner. The conversation was interrupted by David Chen, who approached with champagne glasses and the satisfied expression of a lawyer whose long-term strategy had exceeded even his optimistic expectations. Alex, I've been thinking about our first conversation, about ownership transfer, and I realize I completely underestimated your potential for business leadership. What do you mean? I mean, I thought we were solving a succession problem for a small family business. I never imagined we were launching a business empire that would attract acquisition interest from national firms within 2 years. The empire he was referring to hadn't been built through aggressive expansion or flashy marketing campaigns. Instead, it had grown through systematic attention to operational excellence, client satisfaction, and employee development. The boring, methodical approach to business improvement had created sustainable competitive advantages that larger firms found impossible to ignore. The most impressive thing, David continued, is that you built this success while maintaining the values that made you want to help your family in the first place. The business grew, but it never became ruthless or exploitative. He was right. Throughout the expansion and acquisition process, I'd been careful to maintain the collaborative, supportive culture that had made Martinez Construction an attractive place to work. Employee satisfaction surveys consistently showed high ratings for job security, professional development opportunities, and management accessibility. The business success hadn't come at the expense of the people who made it possible. Later in the evening, I stepped outside for a few minutes of quiet reflection, needing space to process the magnitude of what was being celebrated. The acquisition would close within 30 days, transforming me from a regional business owner into a multi-millionaire executive with responsibility for expanding Meridian's construction operations across the Midwest. The financial windfall was significant, but it wasn't the most important outcome of the journey that had begun with Uncle Bob's microphone humiliation. The real transformation had been personal, psychological, and completely irreversible. The shy girl, who had hidden her capabilities to avoid threatening other people's egos, had evolved into a confident leader who insisted on recognition for her contributions. The reunion incident that had felt so devastating at the time had actually been the beginning of my authentic professional life. The laughter that had followed me out of the community center had been the sound of old limitations being broken, making room for possibilities I'd been too cautious to pursue while trying to maintain family harmony. My phone buzzed with a text message from my sister Emma, who was completing her graduate degree in business administration and had become one of my most enthusiastic supporters. "Alex, I know you're at the celebration dinner tonight, and I just wanted you to know how proud I am to be your sister. You've shown me what it looks like to build something meaningful through talent and hard work instead of just waiting for opportunities to be handed to you." Emma's message was particularly meaningful because it represented the next generation's perspective on achievement and recognition. Unlike our parents' generation, which had often valued traditional career paths and visible status markers, Emma and her peers were more attuned to entrepreneurial success and systematic value creation. "You've also shown me," her message continued, "that sometimes you have to be willing to make people uncomfortable in order to claim the recognition you deserve." The reunion story has become legendary in our family, not because of the humiliation, but because of how you turned that humiliation into the catalyst for building something incredible. The reunion story had indeed become family legend, though the narrative had evolved significantly as the business success became undeniable. Initially, relatives had focused on the drama of the confrontation and the shock of the ownership reveal. Over time, the story had transformed into something more inspiring, a narrative about quiet competence eventually being recognized and rewarded on a scale that exceeded everyone's expectations. As I returned to the celebration dinner, I was approached by several employees who wanted to share their perspectives on the acquisition and their experiences working for Martinez Construction under my leadership. Their comments provided insight into how the company culture had evolved during the transformation from family business to professional operation. "Ms. Johnson, I've been with the company for 6 years, and I can honestly say that the last 2 years have been the most rewarding of my career," said Jennifer Martinez, our head of project coordination, "not just because of the growth and success, but because of the way you've created opportunities for professional development and advancement." Jennifer's experience was representative of many employees who had flourished under the systematic approach to human resources management I'd implemented. Instead of the informal, relationship-based approach to employee development that had characterized the old Martinez Construction, we now had structured training programs, clear advancement criteria, and regular performance evaluations that provided meaningful feedback and development opportunities. "The acquisition is exciting," Jennifer continued, "because it means we'll have even more resources for employee development and career advancement. But honestly, the most important thing is that we're keeping the culture and values that made this such a great place to work." The preservation of company culture during the acquisition had been one of my primary negotiation points with Meridian Holdings. Their executives had been impressed by our employee retention rates and satisfaction scores, recognizing that the human capital was as valuable as the financial assets they were acquiring. Michael Torres, one of our newest project managers, offered a different perspective on the company's evolution. "Ms. Johnson, I was hired 18 months ago, right in the middle of the company's rapid growth phase. What impressed me most during the interview process was how systematically everything was organized. Clear processes, documented procedures, accountability at every level." Michael's experience highlighted one of the most significant changes I'd implemented during the transition to official leadership. The informal, relationship-based management style that had worked for a small family business had been completely inadequate for a growing regional operation. Systematic approaches to project management, client communication, and quality control had been essential to managing the complexity of our expanded operations. Working here has been like getting a masterclass in business operations, Michael continued. I've learned more about strategic planning and systematic management in 18 months than I learned in 5 years at my previous company. The educational value of the Martinez construction experience had become one of our recruiting advantages, attracting ambitious professionals who saw the company as a place where they could develop advanced skills while contributing to continued growth and success. As the celebration dinner concluded, Uncle Bob approached me for a private conversation that felt like the final chapter of our complicated relationship. His expression was thoughtful, reflective in a way that reminded me of our best moments during the early days of our business collaboration. Alex, I've been thinking about what to say to you tonight, and I keep coming back to the same thing. Thank you. Thank you for what? For saving my business, for saving my reputation, for making it possible for me to retire with dignity instead of watching everything I'd built collapse because I was too proud to admit I needed help. His gratitude was genuine, but it also reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what had actually happened during our collaboration. I hadn't saved his business. I'd built my own business using the foundation he'd provided. The distinction was important because it represented the difference between being helpful and being transformational. Bob, you gave me the opportunity to prove what I was capable of building. Everything that happened after that was the result of systematic work and strategic planning, not rescue operations. Maybe so, but without your vision and expertise, Martinez Construction would have remained a small-town operation struggling to compete with more modern firms. You turned it into something that attracted acquisition interest from national companies. He was right about the transformation, though I wanted him to understand that it hadn't been accomplished through some magical intervention. The business success had been the result of systematic improvements in operations, strategic positioning in attractive markets, and consistent execution of client service standards that exceeded industry norms. The most important thing, Bobby I continued, is that you did it with integrity. You could have pushed me out completely, taken full control, and cut family members loose when they weren't contributing value. Instead, you found ways for everyone to succeed in roles that match their actual capabilities. The integrity he was referencing had been deliberate, reflecting my belief that business success shouldn't require the destruction of personal relationships. The challenge had been finding ways to implement professional standards and accountability while maintaining family connections that were important to me despite their complications. Bob, the business transformation was always about building something sustainable and valuable, not about winning some competition for family dominance. The acquisition proves that we built something worth buying, and everyone who contributed to that success should benefit from it. As the evening concluded and guests began to leave, I found myself alone in the same spot where Uncle Bob had pointed that microphone at me and called me a failure 18 months earlier. The physical space was identical, but everything else had changed in ways that would have been impossible to imagine during that humiliating moment. The shy, overlooked family member who had been mocked for her lack of direction had built and sold a construction empire worth $47 million. The quiet girl who had accepted diminished recognition for her contributions had become a confident executive sought after by national firms for her leadership expertise. The reunion incident that had felt like a personal catastrophe had actually been the catalyst for the most successful period of my professional life. But the most significant transformation hadn't been financial or professional. It had been psychological. I had finally learned the difference between being helpful and being valued, between being useful and being respected, between contributing to other people's success and building my own legacy. The acquisition by Meridian Holdings represented more than just a lucrative exit strategy for a successful business. It was validation that the systematic approach to value creation I'd developed could be replicated and scaled, recognition that my leadership capabilities were valuable in markets far beyond the regional construction industry where I'd first proven myself. As I drove home that night to the house I'd purchased with profits from the business I'd built, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The humiliation of the reunion had been real and painful, but it had also been necessary. Without that moment of forced clarity, I might have continued indefinitely as the invisible architect of other people's success, contributing value while accepting minimal recognition. The laughter that had followed me out of the community center had been the sound of old limitations breaking apart, making room for authentic leadership that was based on demonstrated competence rather than inherited authority or careful modesty. The family failure had become the family success story. But more importantly, the quiet helper had become a confident leader who understood her own worth and insisted that others recognize it. The acquisition agreement would close in 30 days, beginning a new chapter where I would apply the Martinez construction model to multiple markets under the Meridian umbrella. It was an opportunity to prove that the business transformation hadn't been a one-time achievement, but rather a repeatable approach to systematic value creation. But tonight, as I settled into my home office to review the acquisition documents one final time, I allowed myself to simply appreciate how far I'd traveled from that devastating moment when Uncle Bob had humiliated me in front of our entire family. The girl they'd laughed at had built an empire, sold it for millions, and emerged as a respected leader whose expertise was sought after by sophisticated investors and corporate executives. The reunion had ended with humiliation, but it had led to a transformation that exceeded my wildest expectations. The quiet competence that had been dismissed as inadequate had proven to be the foundation for sustainable competitive advantages that larger firms found impossible to ignore. And tomorrow, I would wake up as a multimillionaire executive with responsibility for building similar success stories in markets across the Midwest, secure in the knowledge that I had earned every bit of recognition through talent, hard work, and the courage to finally claim credit for contributions that were undeniably mine. The girl they'd laughed at had gotten the last laugh after all, and it was sweeter than any revenge could have been because it was built on achievement rather than spite, on systematic value creation rather than dramatic gestures, on the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the best response to being underestimated is simply to prove everyone wrong through sustained excellence that speaks for itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. The microphone screeched with feedback as Uncle Bob grabbed it from the DJ's hands, his face red from too much beer in the summer heat. I was standing by the dessert table, trying to blend into the background like I always did at these family gatherings, when his booming voice cut through the chatter of 30 relatives packed into the Riverside Community Center. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You know what? He slurred, pointing directly at me across the crowded room. Some people in this family actually make something of themselves. And then there's Alex over there, 28 years old and still can't figure out what she wants to be when she grows up. The laughter that followed wasn't the gentle kind you hear at wedding toasts. It was sharp, cutting, the kind that makes your stomach drop and your face burn. I felt every pair of eyes in that room turn toward me, some amused, others uncomfortable, but none of them defending me. My cousin Danny, Bob's golden boy, raised his beer bottle in mock salute. "To the family dreamer," he called out, and more laughter rippled through the crowd. I stood there holding a paper plate with a slice of my Aunt Carol's apple pie, feeling smaller than I had since middle school. But what my uncle didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 47 minutes, David Chen, Bob's business partner and lawyer, would be making an announcement that would turn that laughter into stunned silence. My name is Alexandra Johnson, but everyone calls me Alex, and I've been the invisible architect of my family's success for longer than any of them realize. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Ohio, I was the middle child who learned early that being loud didn't get you noticed. Being useful did. While my older brother Jake played football and my younger sister Emma charmed everyone with her violin recitals, I became the problem solver, the one who quietly made things work. It started small. In high school, I designed the flyers for my mom's PTA fundraisers. In college, I built my dad's landscaping website during winter break. When my grandmother needed help organizing her estate sale, I spent 3 weekends sorting through 50 years of belongings and created an online catalog that tripled her expected earnings. I never asked for credit. I just saw problems and fixed them. Uncle Bob's construction company, Martinez Construction and Development, had been struggling for years. Everyone in the family knew it, though nobody talked about it directly. At holiday dinners, we'd hear whispered conversations about delayed projects, unhappy clients, and mounting bills. Bob would brush off concerns with his trademark bluster, talking about how the construction business was all about weathering storms and coming out stronger. 3 years ago, at Christmas dinner, I overheard him telling my dad about losing a major contract to a competitor who had a flashier presentation and better marketing materials. Bob was frustrated, gesturing wildly with his fork as he explained how these new companies were all about image and social media nonsense instead of good old-fashioned hard work. I didn't say anything that night, but the next week, I drove to his office on Route 33. The building was a converted warehouse with peeling paint and a handwritten sign that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Inside, Danny was supposed to be managing the administrative side of things, but mostly he seemed to be playing video games on an ancient desktop computer while fielding the occasional phone call. "Hey, Alex," he said without looking up from his screen. "Dad's out on a job site. You need something?" I asked to see their marketing materials, their website, their client proposals. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. Their website looked like it had been built in 1999 and abandoned. Their business cards were printed on cheap paper with a font that screamed amateur. Their project proposals were typed on letterhead with a logo that looked like Danny had designed it in Microsoft Paint during lunch break. "This is what you're sending to potential clients?" I asked, holding up a wrinkled proposal with coffee stains. Danny shrugged. "Dad says the work speaks for itself. He doesn't believe in all that fancy marketing stuff." But I knew better. In today's world, perception mattered as much as performance. Clients made decisions based on first impressions, and Martinez Construction was making terrible first impressions. I spent the next weekend rebuilding their entire digital presence. I designed a professional logo, created a sleek website with a portfolio of their best work, and developed a comprehensive branding package. I didn't ask permission. I just did it, the way I always did when I saw something that needed fixing. The following Monday, I presented everything to Uncle Bob. His reaction was complicated. He was impressed by the quality of the work, but defensive about the implication that his old methods weren't working. "This looks real professional, Alex," he admitted, scrolling through the new website on his phone. "But I've been running this business for 25 years without all this computer nonsense." "And how's that working out?" I asked gently, gesturing toward the stack of overdue invoices on his desk. That got his attention. Over the next hour, I showed him analytics from his competitors' websites, explained how most clients research contractors online before making contact, and demonstrated how a professional digital presence could justify higher prices and attract better clients. By the end of our conversation, Bob had agreed to let me handle the computer stuff on a trial basis. He offered to pay me, but I declined. "Family helps family," I told him. Besides, I had a good job as a marketing coordinator at a tech startup in Columbus. This was just something I could do on weekends. What started as a weekend project became a quiet partnership that transformed his business. I created social media accounts that showcased their work in progress, developed a content calendar that positioned Bob as a local construction expert, and designed proposal templates that looked like they came from a Fortune 500 company instead of a struggling family business. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within 6 months, Martinez Construction had more inquiries than they could handle. Bob started landing contracts with upscale clients who were willing to pay premium prices for quality work. The company's revenue doubled, then tripled. But here's the thing about Uncle Bob. He's never been good at sharing credit. At family gatherings, he'd tell stories about his business turnaround, about how he'd figured out how to play the marketing game and outmaneuver his competitors. He'd talk about his new high-end clients and big contracts with the swagger of someone who'd single-handedly built an empire. "You've got to adapt with the times," he'd say, tapping his temple with his finger.